In 2009, a small team of scientists and conservationists stood at the edge of Knapdale Forest in western Scotland, preparing to release 11 beavers into the wild. These animals had been brought from Norway, carefully quarantined and checked for diseases before being introduced to 3 different lochs connected by winding streams. It was a modest experiment, the first official beaver reintroduction in Britain in nearly 400 years. No one expected miracles. The goal was simply to see if these animals could survive in a landscape that had forgotten them and to monitor whatever changes might follow. The beavers had been extinct in Scotland since the late 1500s, hunted to extinction for their fur, meat, and castoreum, a substance used in medicines and perfumes across Europe. Their absence had gone largely unnoticed for generations. Rivers flowed as they always had, or so it seemed. Floods came and went. Droughts dried up streams. Land managers built drainage systems, straightened waterways and reinforced banks with concrete and steel. It was all part of managing a modern landscape, keeping water where it was supposed to be and away from farms, roads, and villages. But when engineers and hydrologists began reviewing the data from Knapdale a few years into the trial, something didn't add up. The numbers coming back from the monitoring equipment installed along the streams showed patterns that made no sense according to standard hydraulic models. Water was being held in the landscape far longer than any computer simulation had predicted. In some sections of the valley, retention rates had jumped by 60%. Even stranger, during heavy rainfall, the flood peaks measured downstream had dropped by half compared to historical records. The scientists checked their equipment, they recalibrated sensors and reviewed their baseline data. Everything was functioning correctly. The readings were accurate. What they were seeing was real, but it contradicted much of what they understood about how water moves through a catchment area. According to conventional hydrology, water follows predictable paths. It flows downhill, accelerates in narrow channels, and spreads out in wider sections. You can model it with equations, predict flood peaks based on rainfall intensity, and design defenses accordingly. Engineers had spent decades perfecting these models, building multi-million-pound flood defense systems based on proven calculations. Yet here in Knapdale, a handful of beavers appeared to have achieved what those expensive engineering projects often struggled to deliver. The flood peaks weren't just slightly lower, they were dramatically reduced, and the effect seemed to grow stronger as more beaver dams appeared across the valley. Water that would normally have rushed downstream within hours was now taking days to make the same journey. It was pooling behind structures made of mud, sticks, and chewed branches, then slowly seeping into the surrounding soil and vegetation. The lead hydrologist from the University of Stirling later admitted that their computer models simply couldn't reproduce what was happening on the ground. The software had been designed to account for various factors like soil permeability, vegetation cover, and channel geometry. It could handle complex scenarios involving multiple tributaries and varying rainfall patterns, but it hadn't been programmed to account for the cumulative effect of dozens of small dams built by animals that seemed to understand water flow better than trained engineers. This wasn't supposed to happen. Natural flood management had been gaining attention in recent years as climate change brought more extreme weather events. Planting trees, restoring peatlands, and creating wetlands were all recognized as useful tools. But they were generally seen as supplementary measures, things you did alongside proper engineered defenses. The idea that animals could outperform human infrastructure seemed almost absurd, yet the data from Knapdale suggested exactly that. Scotland had been grappling with flooding problems for years. Communities along the River Tay, the Spey, and numerous smaller waterways regularly faced inundation during winter storms. Insurance claims ran into millions. Homes were evacuated. Roads closed. The Scottish government had invested heavily in flood defences, building walls, deepening channels, and installing pumping stations. These solutions worked to varying degrees, but they were expensive to build and maintain, and they didn't always perform as expected when faced with unprecedented rainfall. What made the beaver results even more remarkable was their cost. The Knapdale trial required funding for monitoring equipment, staff time, and community liaison work. But the beavers themselves worked for free. They required no fuel, no maintenance crews, no replacement parts. Once released, they simply did what beavers do: cut down trees, build dams, and reshape their environment to suit their needs. In the process, they were apparently solving problems that had cost engineers considerable time, money, and expertise. The implications were significant enough to make people uncomfortable. If a few beavers could achieve flood reduction results that rivaled or exceeded conventional defenses, what did that say about how we'd been managing rivers for the past century? Had we been making things worse by straightening channels and draining wetlands? Were there other natural processes we'd disrupted without fully understanding their value? The questions went beyond just flooding. The monitoring teams in Knapdale were recording changes in water quality, sediment transport, and biodiversity. Areas that had been relatively barren were sprouting new vegetation. Birds were returning to nest in places they'd avoided for decades. Amphibians were breeding in newly created ponds. The beavers weren't just managing water, they were rebuilding entire ecosystems. But this raised another set of questions. If the results were so impressive, why hadn't anyone tried this sooner? Part of the answer lay in public perception and legal restrictions. Beavers were classified as an extinct native species, but reintroducing them required navigating complex regulations and addressing concerns from landowners, farmers, and fishing interests. There was genuine worry about potential damage to agricultural land, forestry plantations, and fish populations. The Knapdale trial had been designed partly to address these concerns through careful monitoring and open communication with local communities. Still, the resistance went deeper than practical worries. For generations, the idea of deliberately introducing animals that would alter the landscape had seemed reckless. Modern land management was about control, predictability, and optimization for human use. Beavers represented something different, a force that would reshape rivers according to their own needs, creating wetlands where none were planned and flooding areas that might be more valuable as pasture or cropland. The scientists monitoring Knapdale found themselves caught between two worldviews. On one hand, they had compelling evidence that natural processes could deliver significant benefits. On the other hand, they understood the legitimate concerns of people whose livelihoods depended on managing land in specific ways. The data was clear, but the path forward was anything but simple. As news of the Knapdale results began to spread through scientific journals and government reports, it attracted attention from hydrologists, ecologists, and land managers across Britain and beyond. Here was an experiment that appeared to challenge fundamental assumptions about river management and ecological restoration. It raised the possibility that some of our most persistent environmental problems might have solutions that didn't require massive infrastructure projects or complex nets. Technology. Sometimes the answer might be as simple as stepping back and letting nature do what it had done for thousands of years before we interrupted it. But that realization also came with a question that no one could yet fully answer. If beavers could engineer rivers better than humans, what did we really understand about controlling water? And why had we convinced ourselves that our way was best? Long before the Knapdale experiment, Scottish rivers operated under entirely different rules. Water moved through landscapes thick with ancient woodland, slowed and diverted by an intricate network of beaver dams that transformed straight streams into complex mosaics of pools, marshes, and braided channels. These structures weren't permanent fixtures. They shifted with the seasons, washing out in floods and being rebuilt in dry spells, creating a dynamic system that held water during wet periods and released it gradually when rain stopped falling. Beavers weren't exotic visitors in this landscape. They were as much a part of Scotland's natural heritage as red deer or golden eagles. Archaeological evidence shows they'd been present for thousands of years, their remains turning up in peat deposits and ancient middens across the country. Medieval records mention them casually, the way modern documents might reference rabbits or foxes. They were simply there, shaping rivers in ways that people had long since accepted as normal. But beavers possessed something that made them valuable to humans: fur. Their pelts were dense and waterproof, prized for making warm clothing that could withstand harsh northern winters. The fur trade that emerged in medieval Europe created a market that reached from Scotland to the continent, with beaver pelts commanding high prices in cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Beyond their fur, beavers provided meat that was permitted during religious fasting periods, since they were classified as fish due to their aquatic lifestyle. Their castoreum, a secretion used in scent marking, became sought after for use in medicines and perfumes, valued for its distinctive musky aroma. The combination of these factors proved fatal. Hunting pressure increased steadily through the 1400s and 1500s. Unlike deer or other game animals that could retreat to remote areas, beavers were tied to waterways, making them relatively easy to locate and trap. Their habit of building obvious structures meant hunters always knew where to look. Family groups living in lodges could be wiped out in a single expedition. The animals had no natural wariness of humans, having evolved in a landscape where their main predators were wolves and bears, not trap-setting hunters. Historical records from the period are fragmentary, but they sketch a clear trajectory. References to beavers become less frequent as the 16th century progresses. By the late 1500s, most accounts suggest they'd vanished entirely from Scotland. The exact date of the last beavers' death isn't recorded. There was no ceremony, no recognition that something significant had ended. It simply happened, somewhere in the Highlands or along a lowland stream, and then they were gone. What followed their extinction wasn't immediately obvious. Rivers still flowed, rain still fell. Life continued much as before. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Without beavers constantly building and maintaining dams, water began moving through the landscape differently. Streams that had meandered through wetlands began cutting straighter paths. The complex network of pools and marshes that had characterized river valleys started to drain away. Water that had once been held in the landscape, seeping slowly into groundwater and maintaining base flows during dry periods, now rushed more directly to the sea. The changes accumulated slowly over generations, so gradually that no single generation noticed the full extent of what was being lost. Wetlands that had stretched across valley floors shrank to narrow strips along stream banks. The rich diversity of plants adapted to waterlogged conditions disappeared, replaced by species that thrived in drier ground. Without the standing water that beaver ponds provided, breeding sites for amphibians vanished. Dragonflies and other insects that depended on still water became scarcer. Birds that had nested in wetland vegetation moved elsewhere or declined in numbers. The soil itself changed character. Wetlands act as massive sponges, absorbing rainfall and releasing it slowly. Without them, water ran off more quickly, carrying topsoil with it. Stream banks that had been stabilized by dense root systems began eroding. Rivers cut deeper into their beds, lowering water tables and further drying out the surrounding land. The Great Caledonian Forest, which once covered much of Scotland, had already been reduced by centuries of human activity. The loss of beavers accelerated the drying and fragmentation of what remained. Flooding patterns shifted too, though this change took longer to become apparent. With less water being stored in the landscape, rivers responded more sharply to rainfall. When storms hit, water that would once have pooled behind hundreds of small dams now flowed directly into streams, creating higher and faster flood peaks. Conversely, during dry spells, the lack of stored water meant streams dried up more quickly. The buffering effect that beaver-engineered wetlands had provided was gone, replaced by a more volatile, less predictable water system. But here's what makes this story particularly interesting. Nobody realized what had happened. The generations who remembered Scotland with beavers died out. Their children grew up in a landscape without them, and to those children, this was simply how rivers were supposed to look. Maps from the 1600s and 1700s show waterways as straight blue lines, their previous complexity forgotten or never known. The language changed too. Old. Scots words for beaver-related features faded from use. Place names that might have referenced beaver colonies lost their original meanings as memories dimmed. By the 1800s, when scientists began studying Scottish ecology in earnest, beavers were so thoroughly absent that many naturalists weren't even aware they'd once lived there. The idea that these animals had been native, let alone that they'd played a significant role in shaping the landscape, would have seemed strange to Victorian naturalists cataloguing Scotland's wildlife. They were studying a degraded ecosystem but had no baseline for comparison. They thought they were documenting pristine nature when in fact they were observing an environment already fundamentally altered by human activity. This phenomenon has a name now: shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation accepts the conditions they grew up with as normal, unaware that things were different in the past. The naturalists of the 1800s had no memory of beaver-engineered rivers, so they saw Scotland's streams as natural in their simplified state. When floods came, they were treated as unavoidable natural disasters rather than symptoms of a disrupted hydrological system. When wetlands continued to disappear, drained for agriculture or development, few recognized that they were erasing the last remnants of something much more extensive. The 20th century brought accelerated change. Improved drainage technology allowed landowners to dry out areas that had resisted earlier efforts. Rivers were straightened and deepened to move water quickly off the land. Concrete flood defenses went up around vulnerable towns and villages. All of these interventions made sense within the framework of modern land management. Control water, maximize productive land, protect human settlements. But they were all responses to problems that might not have existed, or at least not to the same degree if the landscape still functioned as it had when beavers were present. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a few scientists and historians began questioning this amnesia. They started piecing together evidence from old documents, place names and archaeological finds, gradually reconstructing a picture of what Scotland's rivers had once been like. They found references to extensive wetlands in areas that were now farmland. They discovered accounts of wildlife abundance in places that had long since been drained and cultivated. Slowly, a different narrative emerged, that the loss of beavers might have triggered a cascade of changes that had fundamentally altered how Scottish landscapes functioned. This realization raised an uncomfortable question. If beavers had played such a significant role in maintaining healthy river systems, and if their absence had contributed to problems with flooding, drought, and biodiversity loss, could bringing them back help reverse some of this damage? It seemed almost too simple. Surely modern environmental problems required modern technological solutions, not medieval animals building dams from sticks and mud. But the evidence kept accumulating. Studies from other parts of Europe where beavers had survived or been reintroduced showed dramatic effects on local hydrology and ecology. Researchers began finding scientific explanations for things that had once been dismissed as folklore. The idea moved from the fringes of ecological thinking into serious policy discussions. By the early 2000s, with climate change making flood management more urgent and biodiversity loss accelerating, some conservationists and scientists began arguing that beaver reintroduction wasn't just sentimentally appealing, it was practically necessary. The land itself seemed to be waiting. 400 years after the last beaver vanished, Scotland's rivers still bore the scars of their absence. But beneath the straightened channels and drained wetlands, the potential for recovery remained. The question was whether anyone would be willing to take the risk of finding out what might happen if these engineers of the natural world were allowed to return and do what they'd done for millennia before humans interrupted them. The 11 beavers that arrived in Knapdale Forest in May 2009 didn't step directly into their new home. They spent weeks in quarantine first, monitored carefully by veterinarians checking for diseases and parasites that might spread to native wildlife. The animals had been captured in Norway, where beaver populations were healthy and well studied, making them ideal candidates for reintroduction. Once cleared, they were transported to 3 separate lochs in the forest, divided into small family groups. The release itself was deliberately low-key. No crowds, no fanfare, just scientists and a few local observers watching as the animals slipped into the water and disappeared among the reeds. What made this different from earlier, unauthorized beaver releases elsewhere in Scotland was the scale of monitoring that accompanied it. This wasn't just about putting animals back into the wild and hoping for the best. The Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, who led the project, had designed a comprehensive research programme to track every measurable aspect of what happened next. Nature Scotland, the government's conservation agency, oversaw independent monitoring to ensure the data couldn't be dismissed as biased. The scientific infrastructure went in first. Hydrologists from the University of Stirling installed pressure sensors and flow gauges at multiple points along the streams that connected the 3 lochs. These instruments would record water levels and flow rates continuously, creating a detailed picture of how water moved through the system. Baseline surveys documented everything that existed before the beavers started working: water chemistry readings, pH levels, turbidity measurements, dissolved oxygen content. Teams counted and identified every dragonfly species, catalogued fish populations in each section of stream, and mapped vegetation down to individual plants in marked plots. Camera traps were positioned strategically along the waterways, their infrared sensors ready to capture the beavers' nocturnal activities. Field teams established transects through the forest, fixed routes they would walk repeatedly to record changes in tree cover and undergrowth. Every observation went into logbooks and databases. The project had a 5-year timeline chosen deliberately to capture multiple seasonal cycles and account for year-to-year variation in weather and animal behavior. If things went wrong, if the beavers failed to thrive or caused unacceptable damage, they could be removed. If the results justified it, Scotland might consider expanding the programme. The first signs of beaver activity appeared within days. A local ranger making his morning rounds found freshly gnawed alder stumps near one of the lochs, the Wood Brighton, clean where teeth had stripped away bark. By the following week he spotted the first dam, a modest pile of sticks and mud wedged between tree roots, barely 30 centimetres high but enough to noticeably slow the stream flowing past it. The beavers worked mostly at night, cutting down saplings with their powerful incisors, dragging branches into position and packing the gaps with mud, stones and vegetation. Each piece was placed deliberately, the animals seeming to understand intuitively how water would push against their structure and where reinforcement was needed. These weren't the massive dams that beavers build on larger North American rivers. Knapdale's streams were narrow, the terrain gentle, so the structures tended to be smaller and more numerous. But what they lacked in individual size, they made up for in cumulative effect. By the end of the first year, the rangers had counted 3 complete dams. By the second year, that number had grown to 5. By the third year, there were more than a dozen scattered across the valley. Each dam was unique. Some were simple affairs, little more than heaps of chewed branches lodged between rocks. Others rose knee-high, carefully engineered structures with water spilling over their crests in gentle cascades. Behind each one, water spread out, transforming narrow channels into shallow pools. The pools connected through a network of smaller channels that wound between hummocks of moss and sedge. Water that had once rushed straight from the hills to the loch now took a meandering path, passing through pool after pool, each one slowing its momentum a bit more. The transformation of the landscape became harder to ignore with each passing season. Where a single defined stream had existed, now there was a patchwork of aquatic habitats. Marshy flats appeared in areas that had been dry for decades. Water seeped sideways into the soil, raising groundwater levels and creating conditions that suited completely different plant communities. Willow and birch, which beavers favour for food and building material, sprouted vigorously in the disturbed ground around felled trees. Sedges and irises colonised the muddy edges of new ponds. Reed beds expanded into old drainage ditches, swallowing the human-engineered channels beneath tangles of vegetation. The rangers kept meticulous records, sketching maps that showed new dams and flooded areas, noting which trees had been felled and where new vegetation was taking hold. Their notebooks filled with observations, deer tracks pressed into mud that had been dust the previous year, frogs spawn in pools where none had been seen in living memory, dragonflies darting above water where only dry bracken had grown. The valley's character was shifting, not dramatically from one week to the next, but steadily, accumulating changes that added up to something significant. The beavers themselves proved to be persistent engineers. When storms washed out their dams, they rebuilt them, often in the same location but stronger than before. They patched leaks, adjusted designs, and responded to changing water levels with modifications that suggested they were actively monitoring their structure's performance. Some dams failed permanently and were abandoned. Others became long-term projects, growing taller and longer as the animals added material year after year. By the 5th year, when the monitoring program reached its planned conclusion, the numbers coming back from the instruments told a story that surprised even the researchers who had advocated for the trial. More than 100 beaver dams now exist in the Knapdale valleys. Some stretched more than 30 meters across, creating reservoirs that held thousands of liters of water. The pressure sensors and flow gauges recorded effects that the original models hadn't predicted. Water retention in some monitored sections had increased by 60% compared to baseline measurements. This meant that after rainfall, water was staying in the landscape far longer before reaching the loch. It was pooling behind dams, yes, but also seeping into the surrounding soil, raising water tables and feeding into shallow groundwater systems. The effect extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of the dams themselves. Even more striking were the flood peak reductions. During heavy rain events, the monitoring stations downstream recorded flow reductions between 30 and 60% compared to what the baseline data suggested should have occurred. Water that would normally have surged through the system in a matter of hours was now being detained in a chain of natural reservoirs, each one catching, storing, and gradually releasing water. The cumulative effect was greater than anyone had anticipated. The lead hydrologist reviewing the data admitted openly that their computer models couldn't reproduce what was actually happening. The models had been built on conventional understanding of how water moves, through catchments, accounting for factors like rainfall intensity, soil saturation, channel geometry, and vegetation cover. But they hadn't accounted for the dynamic, self-modifying system that Beavers created. Each dam altered flow patterns in ways that affected the next dam downstream. Water was spreading laterally into areas the models had assumed would remain dry. The sediment being deposited behind dams was changing channel morphology in real time, creating new flow paths that hadn't existed in the baseline surveys. Engineers who had spent careers designing flood defenses found themselves studying diagrams of stick and mud structures built by animals with brains the size of oranges. The comparison was humbling. Conventional flood defenses worked by brute force, build a wall high enough and strong enough to contain floodwaters. Beaver dams worked differently, creating a distributed system of small storage areas that collectively absorbed flood energy before it could build to dangerous levels. And unlike concrete and steel, which required constant maintenance and eventually failed, the Beaver system was self-maintaining and adaptive. One concern that had worried fisheries managers from the start was whether these dams would block salmon migration. The answer turned out to be more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Most of the beaver dams were built on small tributary streams, rather than the main river channels that adult salmon used to reach their spawning grounds. Juvenile salmon, however, benefited significantly from the cool, slow-moving pools behind the dams. These provided ideal nursery habitat where young fish could grow larger and stronger before making their journey to the sea. Surveys found juvenile salmon in beaver pools where none had been recorded in years. When heavy rains did occur, many of the smaller dams washed out or became passable, allowing adult fish to continue upstream. The beavers simply rebuilt them afterwards. It was a dynamic system, constantly adjusting to seasonal changes in flow. Far from being a barrier, the beaver-modified habitat appeared to be supporting healthier salmon populations than the straightened, simplified streams that had existed before. The sediment dynamics were equally interesting. Soil and organic material settling out behind the dams meant clearer water flowing downstream. This benefited both fish and aquatic invertebrates that need clean gravel for spawning and feeding. At the same time, the sediment trapped behind dams was building up soil depth in areas that had been eroded, gradually reconstructing the valley floor that had been degraded over centuries. Field teams documented changes in biodiversity that went well beyond just fish. Amphibian populations exploded. Invertebrate diversity increased measurably. Bird species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades began appearing in survey counts. The beavers weren't just managing water, they were rebuilding functional ecosystems that supported dozens of other species. For the scientists, the lesson was clear, but challenging to articulate in conventional engineering terms. The beavers had created something that responded to conditions, adapted to changes, and delivered multiple benefits simultaneously. It wasn't a static solution that you could design once and forget about. It was a living system that required ongoing animal activity to maintain, but in exchange it performed functions that no amount of concrete could replicate. The numbers, once considered impossible, now formed a new understanding of what natural processes could achieve when given the chance to operate at scale. In November 2016, the Scottish Government made it official. Beavers could stay. The 5-year trial at Knapdale had delivered results that were difficult to dispute. The data showed meaningful benefits for flood management, water quality, and biodiversity. But the decision wasn't purely scientific. It represented a choice about what kind of relationship Scotland wanted with its landscapes and wildlife. For conservationists and many local residents who had watched the Knapdale population establish itself, the announcement felt overdue. For others, particularly farmers and landowners whose properties bordered expanding beaver territories, it brought a mixture of uncertainty and concern. The situation at Knapdale had always been relatively controlled. The beavers lived in a managed forest with limited agricultural land nearby. But elsewhere in Scotland, particularly along the River Tay and its tributaries, the story was messier. Beavers had appeared there through unauthorized releases, probably sometime in the early 2000s. Without the careful monitoring and community engagement that had characterized Knapdale, these animals had simply spread through the catchment, building dams wherever conditions suited them. By 2016, the Tayside population numbered in the hundreds, and conflicts were becoming frequent. A farmer whose land bordered a tributary of the Tay found his lower pasture flooded for the third consecutive spring. The water had crept up gradually over the years as beaver dams multiplied upstream. What had been productive grazing land was now a marsh for much of the year. He'd lost income from reduced livestock capacity and faced higher costs moving animals to drier fields. Standing at his fence line, looking at posts half submerged in water that hadn't been there 5 years earlier, he struggled to see how this benefited anyone. Compensation schemes existed on paper. The Scottish Government had established programs to pay for crop damage and provide grants for protective measures like tree guards or flow devices that could manage water levels around beaver dams. But accessing these funds required navigating bureaucratic processes that many farmers found frustrating. Application forms were lengthy and technical. Approval could take months. Not every claim was successful, and the amounts offered didn't always cover actual losses. For farmers already operating on thin margins, the additional burden felt unreasonable. The situation grew tense in some areas. A few landowners, frustrated by what they saw as government indifference to their concerns, took matters into their own hands. Dams were breached at night, sometimes repeatedly, as beavers rebuilt them just as persistently. There were reports of beavers being shot, though proving these incidents was difficult and prosecutions rare. The divide between those who saw beavers as valuable ecological engineers and those who saw them as destructive pests widened into something resembling a culture war. Government officials found themselves trying to balance competing interests without a clear template for how to do it. At a council meeting in Perth, a Nature Scotland representative explained the new management framework to an audience of farmers, conservationists, and local politicians. Beavers were now recognised as a native species, but full legal protection wouldn't take effect until 2019, giving authorities time to develop more comprehensive management policies. In the interim, licenses for lethal control could be issued, but only as a last resort after all other mitigation options had been exhausted. The framework emphasised a hierarchy of responses. First, try to prevent conflicts through good land management and protective measures. Install flow devices that allow water to pass through or around beaver dams without completely removing them. Use fencing to protect valuable trees. Create buffer zones between beaver territories and sensitive agricultural land. Only if these approaches failed, and only if the damage was genuinely severe, would lethal control be considered. Even then, it would be targeted and limited, removing specific problem animals rather than entire populations. This approach satisfied almost no one completely. Conservationists worried that the exceptions would swallow the rule, that licensed culling would become routine rather than exceptional. Farmers felt the restrictions were still too tight, forcing them to try multiple ineffective measures before being allowed to address what they saw as a straightforward pest problem. The middle ground that policymakers hoped to occupy felt more like a no man's land where both sides lobbed criticism. Yet beneath the conflict, something interesting was emerging in the data. Government analysts and university researchers were running cost-benefit analyses that compared beaver-based flood management with conventional engineering approaches. The numbers were striking, if preliminary. A typical concrete flood defence protecting a small community might cost several £1 million to design, build, and maintain over its lifespan. Beaver populations establishing themselves naturally across a catchment cost nothing beyond initial monitoring and occasional conflict management. The hydrological surveys showed that widespread beaver dams could reduce downstream flood peaks by up to 60%, a performance level that would require extensive infrastructure investment to achieve through traditional means. Extrapolating across larger catchments, the potential savings reached into the tens of millions of pounds. But official reports stopped short of declaring beavers a complete solution. The benefits were real in the right context, but so were the costs borne by individual landowners. The challenge was finding ways to distribute both more equitably, ensuring that people who experienced downsides from beaver activity weren't simply told to accept it for the greater good. At Knapdale, the population had stabilised at a sustainable level, limited by available habitat and food resources. The monitoring continued, now focused on longer-term trends and ecosystem development. In Tayside, the situation remained more dynamic and contentious, with the population still expanding into new areas and conflicts arising wherever beavers encountered intensive agriculture or important infrastructure. By 2020, the story that began in Knapdale had crossed into England. The River Otter in Devon had its own beaver population, descended from animals that had escaped or been released illegally. Rather than immediately removing them, the authorities decided to run a trial similar to Knapdale's. The River Otter Beaver trial lasted 5 years, during which researchers tracked the same variables that had been measured in Scotland: water retention, flood peaks, biodiversity changes, and impacts on human land use. The findings echoed the Scottish results. Beaver dams slowed floodwaters, improved water quality by filtering sediment, and created habitat that attracted numerous other species. Water voles, which had been declining across Britain, thrived in the complex vegetation created by beaver activity. Fishing improved in some areas as the diverse habitat structure supported larger populations of prey species. The trial's final report submitted to the UK government concluded that the beavers should be allowed to remain as a permanent population. England's approach to beaver management, informed by lessons from Scotland, emphasised early engagement with local communities and proactive conflict prevention. The success of the River Otter trial opened doors for new projects. Applications for licensed beaver releases began appearing from conservation organisations and landowners interested in exploring natural flood management. Wales started planning its own trials. Policymakers across Britain began incorporating beavers into broader strategies for climate adaptation and nature recovery. But as enthusiasm grew, so did awareness of limitations. The data from both Knapdale and the River Otter showed that beaver engineering worked best in specific contexts: small to medium streams with suitable riparian vegetation and relatively gentle topography. In these settings, beavers could create the complex wetland systems that delivered multiple benefits. Large rivers with steep gradients or heavy flow volumes posed different challenges. Urban waterways hemmed in by development had little room for the lateral expansion that beaver dams created. Intensively farmed floodplains, where every hectare mattered economically, couldn't easily accommodate the unpredictable flooding that beaver activity might cause. Adaptive management became the watchword for practitioners working with beaver reintroduction. This meant accepting that no single approach would work everywhere. Each site required assessment based on local conditions, hydrology, land use, existing ecology, and community attitudes. Sometimes beaver activity needed no intervention. Other times it required flow devices to prevent excessive flooding or fencing to protect specific areas. In cases where conflicts couldn't be resolved, relocating animals might be necessary. The flexibility to adjust approaches based on what was actually happening on the ground rather than rigid adherence to preset plans proved essential. A new generation of land managers and planners began seeing beavers as one tool among many in a larger toolkit for landscape-scale restoration. Their effects were being factored into flood risk models, written into water quality improvement plans, and included in biodiversity targets for river catchments. But the lesson from both Scotland and England was consistent. Natural solutions offered genuine power, but only when combined with patient scientific monitoring, open communication with affected communities, and willingness to intervene when necessary. The climate context gave these discussions added urgency. Weather patterns were becoming more extreme, with heavier rainfall events interspersed with longer dry periods. Traditional flood defences designed for historical weather patterns were being overwhelmed more frequently. Meanwhile, droughts were exposing the vulnerability of water supplies that depended on consistent stream flow. Beaver-modified landscapes, with their water storage capacity and flow regulation, offered resilience that engineered systems struggled to match. Yet questions remained. The exact long-term economic value of beaver reintroduction was still debated. Studies could quantify flood reduction and water quality improvements, but putting precise monetary figures on these benefits involved assumptions that different analysts disputed. The conflicts with agriculture hadn't been solved, just managed to varying degrees of success. In Tayside and other areas where beaver populations continued growing, tensions simmered and occasionally flared. Today, beaver reintroduction in Britain sits at an interesting crossroads. The ecological case is well established through more than a decade of rigorous monitoring. The practical challenges are better understood, if not fully resolved. Policy frameworks exist, though they continue evolving as more is learned. What began as a modest experiment with 11 animals in a remote Scottish forest has grown into a national conversation about how Britain manages its rivers and landscapes. The evidence from Knapdale and subsequent trials shows that natural processes can rival or exceed engineered solutions in specific contexts. After 4 centuries of absence, beavers have done more than reshape rivers. They've challenged fundamental assumptions about control, predictability, and human dominance in landscape management. The question facing Britain now isn't whether beavers can help address environmental challenges, but where they fit into a portfolio of approaches that must balance ecological recovery with legitimate human needs, and how to manage that balance fairly when benefits and costs fall on different groups. The story continues unfolding in rivers across Scotland, England, and Wales, written by animals that never disappeared entirely, but merely waited, somewhere in the genetic memory of landscapes that once knew them well, for a chance to return and resume work they'd been doing for thousands of years before anyone thought to stop them.